So we are here with Nathan Vandercliff, who is the Globe and Mail's foreign correspondent based in Asia right now. How are you, Nathan?
Excellent. How are you?
Good, good. So this is our discussion panel, and again, I'm Kelsey,
I'm John.
I'm Daniela.
I'm Michelle.
Alex.
and we'll just
And I'm
jump right
Nathan.
into our interview. So Angela Murphy mentioned that you spend about 5 years at a time in Beijing, and you get to come back for about 2 weeks for a summer break, and then you get to go right back and spend, the rest of your time over there. Can you just talk about how you plan out a trip that long and what your year looks like?
Yeah. I mean, I've been here for 5 years. I haven't been here. I don't stay here for 5 years at a time. So I moved here in 2013, and this is my home. And so I come back to Canada sometimes on vacation to check in with the family, that sort of thing. But this is home, and anytime I'm back in Canada is generally because I'm not at work.
Taking a little break, I guess. So I have a question in regards to the rise of the denial of the accreditation of visas for foreign workers, especially foreign journalists. Have you seen that it has affected your work, or do you foresee that it will affect your work in the near future?
In China, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. So journalists in China, in general, with very few exceptions, are here on 1 year visas, and those need to be renewed every year. And the renewal of those visas is the chief mechanism used by the authorities here to sort of exert control over journalists who are in China. And so there has not been a rise in particular in denial of visas to journalists, but there has been a rise in the threats to deny those visas to journalists. Sometimes by people who actually have the power to deny visas, sometimes by people who do not have the power to deny visas. For example, local security officials, local police, and that sort of thing, but who are using the threat of visa denial as sort of a threat to sort of secure compliance in the field. And what we have seen more recently are a couple of things. One, in Hong Kong, we had a Financial Times journalist who was denied the renewal of a journalist visa there, which was a really surprising development and a really concerning development because it suggested that Hong Kong, which has typically conducted its affairs with regard to media, much the same way as most Western countries, and we'll see what that means in the future as far as China. And the other thing that we've seen in China is in mainland China is in the last couple of months there have been several foreign correspondents who have been placed on severely truncated visas. So instead of a year, they've been given several months, and we'll see to what degree that persists, to how widespread that practice becomes. But it seems clear that authorities here are using shorter visas as a warning to reporters whose reporting they don't particularly like.
Nathan, you mentioned about threats, so I'd like to talk. You were detained in China 2 years ago, and there's been in recent news that local officials following Chinese journalists. Can you tell us about the dangers and the correspondence that you and them face?
Yeah. So I have somewhere here. It's actually right here. What you get as a foreign correspondent when you come to China is one of these. It's a press card, and it's issued by the government here. I carry that everywhere I go. It's my credential. It's a government issued credential to function as a foreign journalist here in China. And I think on the positive side, that credential continues to provide a fair amount of protection to journalists in China. In general, I know because it signifies that I'm here legally, and it signifies that I'm here working as a journalist legally, and that's a fairly widely known credential among local officials, no matter where you go. So that's on the plus side. On the negative side, it seems as if there is a rise in authorities working to use I suppose what you could call a gray area tactic to harass journalists and to intimidate journalists and to frustrate the work of journalism. And one of those, and of course this is a long-standing practice. But we've seen it come back into vogue, and it appears to be becoming more widespread. Is following people, and in following people, you're doing a couple of things. One, you are making it very clear to a journalist that every action that they do is being scrutinized, which is fine. I mean, we work here legally. But more importantly, what you're doing is you are providing a presence of authorities. Many times these authorities are not in uniform. Many times these authorities refuse to identify themselves either by name or by the organization that they are working with. Our typical assumption is that they work for the secret police, some arm of the secret police, but it's hard to know because they won't confirm who they work for. And so when you have these people on your tail, and by on your tail, I mean literally on your tail. I mean, I've walked around and had somebody following me 5 strides behind. You end up in a situation where people feel intimidated to talk to you. And you also end up in a situation, particularly in areas that China deems sensitive, that you start to become unwilling to speak with people as a journalist because you know that the act of speaking with someone, the act of trying to secure an interview with somebody, could put that person at risk because there's parts of China in which authorities are quite keen to prevent any independent foreign reporting from taking place. And the mere act of sort of engaging in an interview with someone can subject that person to questioning after an interview takes place. It can also it also raises concerns about whether that person could at some point be subjected to measures much more severe than questioning, detention, and other things.
Do you feel that is that a reason that could be the dismissing number of correspondents that are happening in like China and Beijing and Asia? Because we've noticed that. What are your thoughts on that? Could that be a reason?
Hang on a second. Sorry, I had an incoming call. Are you still there?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay,
Can you hear us?
I hope that doesn't come back. Yeah, I can hear you. Although the volume's not very loud. Are you asking if this is becoming more widespread?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. I think so, and I think there are certain areas of China now where there are that are considered incredibly sensitive by the Chinese government, particularly Western China, the Xinjiang region. When I was there a month ago, I rented a car and drove through the region, and I was either followed or tracked for almost 1,600 kilometers. It was a Herculean effort on the part of the people following me. It was something, I think I counted at least 9 cars with 20 people who basically swapped in and out, following me. Occasionally following me at such a close distance that at one point I actually thought they were going to run into me. I thought they were actually putting me physically at risk. This is and so in places that China considers sensitive, that sort of thing is becoming more common. I know that there are other journalists who have gone to Xinjiang who have arrived at the airport, and of course all of the manifests and that sort of thing, passenger manifests, air passenger manifests are available to security authorities here, and they've arrived at the airport. And they've been greeted by somebody who comes up to them in the airport, takes their hand, and says, "Hello, we've been waiting for you." And that's of course a signifier that they are unlikely to be alone for the rest of their time reporting. In a place like Xinjiang, and Xinjiang is quite exceptional in China in terms of all this, but I mean, there is quite a pervasive system of roadblocks, and in those roadblocks, security measures wax and wane. But when I was there on this most recent trip, the moment I showed up with a foreign face, I was told to go inside for a secondary inspection. Every single roadblock, and this was true at one point. I went to 2 roadblocks about 4 or 5 kilometers apart, and I was told that I had to register at both of them. And registering means providing your passport. They take a photograph of your passport. They input your passport information. They take a photograph of your visa. They input your visa information, and that visa information, of course, confirms that you're a journalist. Because it's a journalist visa, and then they take down your phone number, they take down your plate number, and that sort of thing. And so there's a real system of tracking there, and those roadblocks. So those roadblocks are a pretty good way that they can figure out that there are journalists on their turf. The other way is through a system of hotel registration, and this is common across China. It's not unique to Xinjiang. But the moment you show up at a hotel, you scan your passport, you scan your visa, and typically that gets transmitted digitally instantaneously to local security authorities, and so that they will know that there is a journalist staying in their city, in their region. And so in some of these areas, it's become quite easy to track journalists. China is installing to a greater and greater degree new technologies, facial recognition technologies, and this sort of thing. They have used those technologies, at least according to their own state media, to catch people they call criminals at airports, train stations, that sort of thing, to screen people. We've seen some of this in the West as well, the use of facial recognition technology. But it'll be interesting to see what will happen with that in the future, and the degree to which that can also be used to track foreign journalists. Because of course, when we enter China, we are also subject to getting pictures of our faces and that sort of thing.
Have you, Nathan, ever feared for your life reporting?
In China?
Yes.
No. And that goes back to sort of what I initially said about that press card. Now, that press card, I mean, China does I mean, there are lots of reasons to be critical of the way China supports media freedoms, and you can look at where it ranks on sort of World Press Freedom Indexes to see that. But in general, that press card does provide a fair amount of protection, for sure, from physical harm. It doesn't provide necessarily protection from being detained. Journalists are regularly detained in China. Journalists are regularly blocked from going places. A colleague of mine at the BBC was traveling somewhere, again, this is in Xinjiang, and authorities closed off basically every road on the way to the place that he and his crew were going to. They literally blocked all traffic going to these places, declaring those roads closed. When I was in Xinjiang, they did the same. They told me a road was closed for construction, when clearly it wasn't, because there was all kinds of traffic going past. So they'll do all those things. But as far as personal safety, there have been journalists that have been roughed up in China. There have been journalists that have been quite severely beaten in China, if you look back to the historical record. But in general, those are exceptions. And in general, those tend to relate back to local factors, local authorities perhaps seeking to hide something that's happening there, local thugs or perhaps even local criminal interests who are trying to protect their own interests. As far as the central government authorities and that sort of thing, physical safety isn't as much of a concern. There are other places in Asia where there are much greater dangers. I mean, the Philippines right now, there are dangers to journalists. I was in Indonesia at one point where I sort of escaped immigration authorities who were literally trying to chase me down on foot. I don't think I would have feared for my life at that point in time, but I certainly feared at a minimum deportation, at a maximum imprisonment there.
Nathan, I'd like to transition to something that relates to Canada. So you just wrote an article about China's residential schools and how they can learn from Canada's past. Can you explain what's going on for people who may not know?
Yeah, so this is an argument that's being made by the Canadian government. So this is going back to Xinjiang, which is a region where there is a large Muslim population. Many of them are ethnically Uyghurs, which is sort of a Turkic ethnic group. There are other Muslim groups in the area as well. And Uyghurs in particular have been blamed for acts of terrorism in China and abroad over the last number of years. And China in the last few years for a number of years has had crackdowns, terror-related crackdowns in the Xinjiang region. Xinjiang is sort of this big sprawling area in the far west of China. It's a land of deserts and mountains. It's much more sparsely populated than other parts of China. It's quite beautiful, actually, but it's a very, very different part of China. I mean, it's a place that sort of borders sort of Pakistan and Kazakhstan. It's in those areas. It's at a great geographic remove from Beijing. Anyways, And so there have been incidents of violence, terror attacks. There was some very violent, deadly sectarian violence that took place in 2009, and so all of this is combined to produce a response from authorities in China to what they say is terrorism. In the last year or two, what we've had is a campaign to re-educate uh, people that China considers at risk of radicalization. And China doesn't use the word re-educate. They have in the past. They don't use it so much now anymore. They have at some point used the words education through transformation or transformation through education. They've also used, more recently, they've used employment skills and vocational training. And so what they've set up is a network of centers, and there's all sorts of different permutations of these. Some are function like day schools, some are look and feel, and from what we're told, function much like jails. And these are being used to incarcerate large numbers of people, largely, if not exclusively, Muslim. And they're being subjected to education programs. China acknowledges that they are being given what they call political education, legal education, this sort of thing. China says that they are also being provided skills training that can help them sort of get jobs down the road, language training as well. They're learning Chinese, but of course this is forcible. This is forcible incarceration in these centers, and the people that I've spoken with who have spent time in these centers and have been released, which by the way are small numbers. Most people have not been released. Have said that they've been subjected to things like repeated recitation of pledges of loyalty to the Chinese president, pledges of loyalty to the Communist Party, recitation of the Chinese Constitution, and this sort of thing. This sort of thing that we would call political indoctrination. And so because there are such large numbers of people involved in this, because it appears that one of the targets is the normal practice of religion, there are people have told me that they were basically told to recite religion is stupid, I'm stupid for believing in religion, this sort of thing. There is a sense that these camps are being used to attack not just radicalization, but also religion and culture. And so this is where the comparison with residential schools comes in. There's been a growing international critique and criticism of what's happening in Western China. The way Canada has sought to approach this is to say, if you look at our own experience with residential schools, we have experience as a country when we forcibly sought to separate people from their cultures, from their languages, and it hasn't worked out well. It hasn't worked out well at all. It's left a track record, a very long and ugly track record of misery. And so Canada has sought to say, we've got experience in this, and it's not a great idea. It's not clear the degree to which China has responded to this.
I just wanted to ask a question about Hong Kong and Taiwan. I just wanted to know, because China is seizing control over those two countries outside of the mainland slowly, how do you think the current press situation in China is going to affect those two places over time?
Yeah, I mean, Hong Kong is a much larger concern because Hong Kong is part of China. One country, two systems. The two systems part seems to be eroding. The one country part seems to be strengthening. There are definite issues with regard to media freedoms in Hong Kong. It's still largely a freer press environment. Some of the threats to freedom of press in Hong Kong are actually similar to the threats we have seen to the freedom of press in Chinese media in Canada and other Commonwealth nations, which is an ownership threat. Where you get ownership interests that come in from mainland China, and they're purchasing. You're seeing this in Africa, all over Africa as well. They're purchasing media organizations and bringing those media organizations in line with Chinese desires for how those organizations should treat China and that sort of thing. And so we've seen concerns about that in Hong Kong as well. The South China Morning Post, which is the leading English language newspaper, has for a long time been one of the best, if not the best, English language windows into China, is owned by Jack Ma, who's the billionaire founder of Alibaba, and there has been a rise in the South China Morning Post of particularly opinion content that is very pro-Beijing. I think if you read the South China Morning Post carefully, you'll see that they still have a huge number of reporters who are doing really genuinely extraordinary, fearless and important journalism on mainland China as well. So I think they have sought very diligently to strike a balance there. But when you have local authorities in Hong Kong denying a visa to a foreign correspondent because that foreign correspondent, in this case a Financial Times reporter, did a public interview with a member of a political party, an upstart political party, an independent-minded political party that the local authorities don't want to see. I mean, that's a pretty blatant interference in press freedoms, and it has raised a tremendous number of concerns. And I should add, not just in the media world, it's also raised a number of concerns in the corporate world. I mean, Hong Kong has for a very long time been a major financial center, like a huge financial center in Asia. And part of the workings of a respectable financial center are a free and independent press, which of course helps to ensure a degree of honesty in the function of the corporate sector. It also serves as a to verify that the fact that sort of things are functioning under the rule of law. And this move against this Financial Times journalist has caused a lot of consternation in the corporate community as well in Hong Kong. Taiwan is different. Taiwan operates. It is the one China principal policy is that basically there is one China. Beijing claims to rule it all. Taipei also claims to rule it all. And so in Taiwan, they operate effectively as an independent country. They have their own foreign policy and all the rest. And their commitment to democracy appears to be quite strong. Their commitment to a free press appears to be quite strong. There are always concerns about interference in Taiwan, but Taiwan continues to have much less of these concerns than, for example, Hong Kong would.
Just going off of what Alex and Michelle said, with China being involved in a lot of kind of controversies right now, are there any kind of no-go questions? And like, how do these controversies kind of dictate how you interact with fixers and contacts?
In China? Yeah, I mean, no, there's no-go questions. There are areas of reporting that will earn reporters a meeting with the foreign ministry. Those can be unpleasant. I've had two of those in the last 2 months. One of which was unpleasant, and one of which was less unpleasant, which was nice. And in particular, in recent times, we've spoken a lot in this conversation about Xinjiang, and there's a real sensitivity to reporting there. So there aren't really any no-go questions, although authorities are trying to. They've always tried. I mean, to shape the way the foreign press conceives of China, the questions that are asked, and that sort of thing. The premier of China does an annual press conference around the time of 2 sessions, political meetings in the spring. Those questions, at the very least, the topics of those questions and the reporters asking them are pre-screened. Depending on the year, sometimes the actual text of the questions is screened as well. So there are very few opportunities to ask unscreened questions of China's top leadership. On the other hand, there is every day, except for a 2 or 3 month break in the summer, there is a 3 p.m. briefing at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Beijing, in which a spokesperson for the foreign ministry stands on a stage, which any accredited journalist can walk into and ask any question under the sun. There's no pre-screening, there are no limits, there is no censorship of those questions. You can ask any question. You can ask it in English. It'll be translated into Chinese. and that's quite free, and they will respond. There will be a response. Now, those responses, if you are not there in the room, are censored. So if there are topics that they don't want to publicize, there's a daily transcript that gets published of that, and it's routine for questions, and sometimes large numbers of questions and answers to not appear in that transcript. But there is an ability to ask those questions. There is so as far as are there no-go questions, I would say the answer is no. Although asking some questions can sort of provoke a response.
Talk about the Globe and Mail. So you've been there for 9 years. Can you just tell us about what some of the regarding the filing and deadlines and what you so the filing and the deadlines that you the Globe and Mail puts on you?
Yeah, I've been here for 5 years now. The Globe's interesting. It's got an interesting position in China. The Globe opened its first bureau here in 1959. So we have a really long history in China, which is kind of sort of a I guess a cool outcrop of sort of a long Canadian history with China. As far as filing here, I feel in some ways like internet era has been beneficial to me in that sense, because depending on whether we're at daylight savings or not, I am either 12 hours ahead or 13 hours ahead of Toronto, and so if basically my day is drawing to a close as the Eastern time zone is waking up. And so what and traffic wise, one of our biggest, if not our very biggest, traffic portion of the day is in the morning for our website. So I'll often try to file something in time if there's daily news for that morning web rush, so I can get that done, and that allows me to sort of basically wrap up my work here, a daily work by 6-7 p.m. Often what will happen then is that story will then go through the editing process, and I'll either have further edits that come out later in the evening, my time, or by the time I get up 5-6 in the morning, there's an email in my inbox with some edits, additional edits for the print version. Feature stories are a bit different. Sometimes those can involve some really late hours. That can be true in Canada as well, but the time zone can be difficult for that. I feel like the time zone is worst for me though when it comes to sort of interviewing people in North America, because it's a difficult time zone to breach.
Nathan, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to really thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Have a good night.
Yeah.